The storm trapped us, the night changed us. Before we dive into the story, tell me where in the world you're watching from. And if this story steals your heart, please hit subscribe. The heavy oak door of the Pilgrim's Rest splintered inward, vomiting a whirlwind of sea spray and driving rain into the smoky, suffocating warmth of the common room. On the back of that wind, Lady Mary Hastings collapsed across the threshold, a gasp of terror stealing the breath from her lungs as she frantically pushed the ruined tangle of her strawberry blonde hair from her eyes. She scrambled to her feet, her wine-red damask bodice, scandalously undone at the top lace, soaked through and plastered to her skin. The hem of her heavy skirts was not merely damp, but caked in the thick, sucking mud of the coastal track. She registered the sudden silence, the cessation of a badly plucked lute, the clatter of dice stopping mid-roll. Every eye in the timbered alehouse, sailors, fishermen, and a few rough-looking merchants, was fixed upon her, a creature of the court dropped into their squalid world. Her flight had been desperate, a blind run through the tempest, but it was not the storm that made her tremble so violently she could barely stand. It was the sound of horses, the heavy, disciplined hoofbeats that had pursued her from London, that were even now clattering into the inn's muddy yard. Across the room, shrouded in the gloom far from the central hearth, Captain Eric Thorne watched her. He did not move, his broad shoulders resting against the rough-hewn wall, one long leg stretched out into the rushes, the other bent. His left hand, wrapped in a thick, darkening bandage of sailcloth, rested on the table beside a half-empty pewter mug of ale. His storm-tangled, shoulder-length hair was the color of wet sand, and his sea-browned face was stark, unreadable. He saw the quality of her dress, the panicked, high-strung terror of a thoroughbred, and the single pearl drop earring swinging wildly as she panted. He knew danger when it walked through a door, and this woman was danger embodied. He had lost his ship, the Harpy, to this same cursed storm, dashed to pieces on the rocks 2 miles down the coast, and he and the few men he had salvaged were in no mood for more trouble. He looked back into his ale, dismissing her as another's misfortune. The door crashed open again, and this time it was not the wind. Sir Richard Mallet entered, ducking his head under the low beam, the silver inlay on his black velvet doublet gleaming in the firelight. He peeled off his gloves, his thin, pale face pinched with displeasure. "The Queen's business," he announced, his voice slicing through the low murmur of the tavern. His men, armored in leather cuirasses and carrying muskets, fanned out, blocking the exits. The air, already thick with smoke and the smell of stale ale and drying nets, now crackled with fear. Mallet's gaze swept the room, dismissive of the sailors, until it landed on Mary. He smiled, a thin, cruel expression. "Well, well, Lady Mary Hastings, a long run for such a little mouse." He took a step toward her. Mary's eyes darted wildly, seeking an escape that did not exist. The walls were timber, the windows were shuttered against the gale, and the hearth was blocked by dicing sailors. She was trapped. Her gaze flew across the room and collided with the cold, indifferent stare of the wounded man in the corner. He was watching her, his expression unchanged. He was large, formidable, and crucially, he was not one of Mallet's men. It was not a plan. It was an animal instinct, a desperate lunge for the only piece of driftwood in the churning sea. She crossed the room in 3 quick strides, the rushes whispering around her mudded skirts. She reached his table, grabbed his uninjured right hand with both of hers, her skin icy cold against his, and sat down hard on the bench beside him. Mallet stopped, his eyebrows raising in query. Mary looked up at the privateer, her voice a breathless, shocking invention. "I apologize for my tardiness, husband. The road was treacherous." Eric Thorne went utterly still. The entire room held its breath, the only sound the roar of the wind and the hiss of the fire. He looked down at the woman who was crushing his fingers, her knuckles white. He saw the pearl, the fine lace at her cuffs, the sheer, unadulterated panic in her green eyes. He recognized Mallet, or at least his type, a court weasel, a pursuivant, the kind of man who hunted other men for profit and politics. He felt the weight of Mallet's gaze on them both, suspicion warring with irritation. Eric knew this game. He knew that to hesitate was to confirm the lie. Slowly, deliberately, he covered her trembling hands with his massive, bandaged one, engulfing them. The sailcloth was rough against her skin, and the heat radiating from him was a shock. He did not look at her but fixed his gaze on Sir Richard Mallet. "She is cold and weary," Eric's voice rumbled, low and rough as shingle. "We have had a long journey. Your business is with us." the possessive we hung in the air, a challenge. Mallet studied him, taking in the leather jerkin, the salt-stained doublet beneath, and the nicked, well-used cutlass hilt visible at his hip. This was not a courtier. This was something coarser, more dangerous. "Your name, fellow," Mallet snapped, his hand dropping to his own sword. "Thorne," Eric said, offering nothing more. "Captain Eric Thorne, and this is my wife, Mistress Thorne." The word wife felt foreign and heavy on his tongue, but he said it with utter finality. Mallet's lip curled. He clearly did not believe it, but the storm was raging, and the woman had claimed sanctuary with a man who looked capable of splitting him from knave to chaps. "We are trapped here by this tempest, Captain," Mallet sneered, stressing the title. "See that your wife does not wander. I have questions for her when she has recovered her senses." He turned away, signaling to the innkeeper for brandy, his men taking up positions that sealed the room. The immediate danger had passed, but Mary understood with a sinking dread that she had just chained herself to a stranger, trapping them both in a cage of her own making, while the wolf paced just outside the bars. The common room of the Pilgrim's Rest became a microcosm of the world, a cramped, smoky prison sealed by the screaming wind and the armed men at the door. Sir Richard Mallet and his pursuivants had claimed the long trestle table nearest the hearth, their muskets stacked carelessly against the wall, their voices loud and arrogant as they drank their way through the innkeeper's best brandy. Every other soul in the room was compressed into the remaining space, the tension a palpable thing, thick as the smoke from the tallow candles. Mary and Eric remained in their dark alcove, a pocket of silence in the surrounding din. The initial adrenaline of her desperate lie had faded, leaving behind a cold, vibrating fear and the deeply uncomfortable reality of the man beside her. He had not spoken another word since claiming her as his wife. He had simply retrieved his ale, his expression grim, and returned to watching the room with a predator's stillness. Mary sat rigid, her hands clenched in her lap, acutely aware of his proximity. He was large, taking up more than his share of the rough-hewn bench, and he carried the scent of the sea, not the perfumed pomanders of the court, but something raw and elemental: salt, wet leather, and the faint, metallic tang of old blood. "You should eat," he said, his voice startling her. He pushed a wooden trencher toward her, piled with a steaming, glutinous mass of pottage and a hunk of dark bread. The innkeeper, a harassed-looking man named Hobbs, had brought it at Eric's silent command. Mary looked at the food, her stomach churning. "I cannot." "You will," he replied, not unkindly, but with the flat finality of a command. "A swooning woman is a liability. Mallet watches you. He wishes you to be weak." That pragmatic observation cut through her panic. He was right. Mallet was indeed observing them, his narrow eyes flicking to their alcove between sips of brandy. To maintain this fiction, she must appear to be a weary traveler, not a terrified fugitive. She picked up the spoon, her hand shaking so badly she could barely scoop the pottage. Eric sighed, a low sound of exasperation. He took the spoon from her, dipped it, and held it to her mouth. "Eat." It was a gesture of such startling, almost paternal dominance that Mary was too shocked to refuse. She opened her mouth, the hot, savory stew a shock to her cold system. He fed her 3 more spoonfuls, his gaze fixed on her face before she found her strength and took the spoon from him. "I can manage," she whispered, her face burning. "Good," he said, turning back to his ale. As the hours dragged on, the initial shock gave way to a throbbing awareness of her physical state. Her wet clothes were clinging to her, and a deep chill had settled into her bones. Eric watched her shiver, a small, violent tremor that shook her frame. "Hobbs," he called out, his voice cutting cleanly through the noise. The innkeeper scurried over. "My wife is soaked. We need a room and dry clothes, whatever you have." Hobbs wrung his hands. "No rooms, Captain, not proper ones. Every rope bed by the hearth is taken by your men." He gestured to a few sailors, clearly from Eric's crew, who were huddled together. "And Sir Richard's men have the rest." "I do not care," Eric said, dropping a heavy silver coin onto the table. It spun, catching the light. "There is a loft, a storage room, something with a door." Hobbs's eyes widened at the coin, a small fortune for a night's lodging. "Aye," he conceded. "There is the old storage above the kitchens." "It is small, and the bed is but straw, but it is private." "It will serve," Eric said, "and blankets, dry ones, and something for her." Hobbs nodded and disappeared. Eric turned to Mary. "We must maintain the appearance. A husband and wife would not sit freezing in the common room if a bed of any kind was available." He stood, towering over her, and offered her his good hand. Come, mistress. The room was little more than a closet smelling of dried herbs and mice, tucked under the eaves. A single smoking candle revealed a narrow straw pallet on the floor and a small shuttered window against which the rain hammered relentlessly. It was, however, private. Hobbs returned with a pile of rough, clean blankets and a plain wool gown, the color of oatmeal. It was my daughter's, he offered. God rest her. Mary took it, her throat tight. When the innkeeper left, a new, more intense awkwardness settled. They were alone. Turn your back, she said, her voice small. Eric obliged, turning to face the door, his hand resting on the hilt of his cutlass, standing guard even here. Mary stripped off the ruined damask, her fingers clumsy and cold, and pulled the scratchy wool gown over her head. It was blissfully dry. You may turn. When he did, he found her huddled in the blankets on the pallet, her long hair unpinned and falling in a wild, damp curtain around her shoulders. He studied her for a moment, then began with his one good hand to unlace the leather ties of his jerkin. What are you doing? She asked, her voice sharp with new alarm. My doublet is soaked through, he said simply, shrugging out of the heavy jerkin. Underneath, his salt-stained doublet was indeed plastered to his chest, and the linen shirt beneath that was no better. He was a powerful man, his shoulders straining the seams of the fabric. I will not sleep in wet clothes and catch a fever. I would advise you to do the same. Were you not already dry? He worked the buttons of the doublet with his right hand, hissing in frustration as his bandaged left proved useless. Here, Mary said, moving before she could think. She knelt before him on the pallet and began to undo the buttons, her fingers brushing his chest. He was warm, a solid wall of heat. Your hand, she said, her eyes fixed on the stained sailcloth. It needs tending. It is fine, he said too quickly. It is bleeding through, she insisted. And you will lose the use of it if it festers. I know something of wounds. He regarded her, his blue eyes skeptical in the candlelight. A court lady. My father was a physician, she lied, though it was only half a lie. She had spent hours in her father's library, fascinated by his herbals. She pointed to the brandy cask Hobbs had provided for the room. Bring that and the candle. He sat on the single wooden stool, the pallet small, forcing her to kneel almost between his knees. With agonizing care, she unwrapped the crude bandage. The sight beneath made her stomach clench. It was a deep, vicious gash across his palm and the back of his hand, clearly a rope burn from his wrecked ship, but embedded with splinters of wood. It was inflamed and suppurating. This is not fine, she whispered. Without waiting for his permission, she soaked a strip of her discarded linen chemise in brandy and pressed it firmly into the wound. Eric's entire body went rigid, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth, but he did not make another sound. She worked diligently, her touch surprisingly deft, cleaning the grime and using her silver hairpin, the only valuable thing she had left besides the earring, to painstakingly pick out the wooden splinters. He watched her, his face a mask of controlled pain, the candlelight carving shadows under his high cheekbones. She was gentle, her brow furrowed in concentration, the strawberry blonde curls falling forward to veil her face. The temptation was not one of lust, but something stranger, a pull toward the quiet competence of this terrified woman. She was not the weak creature he had assumed, and for Mary the temptation was just as profound. This man, so dangerous and coarse, was submitting to her care, his raw strength held in absolute check. When she was finished, she bound the hand tightly with clean linen. It will hold, she said, meeting his gaze. Thank you, he said, his voice rough. He looked at the pallet, then at her. Take the bed, I will take the floor. The floor is cold and damp, she protested, and you are wounded. I have slept on worse, he said, settling his back against the wall near the door, his cutlass beside him. Get some rest. Mallet will not wait for the storm to break entirely. She lay down, pulling the blankets to her chin, her body thrumming with a strange energy. She was trapped in a tiny, cold room with a wounded privateer, a fugitive from the Queen, but for the first time in days, listening to the steady breathing of the man guarding the door, a small, impossible sliver of safety crept into her heart. The gray, watery light of dawn did nothing to lessen the storm. Instead, it seemed to reveal the full fury of the tempest, the sea a churning cauldron of white-flecked gray. The alehouse below was quiet, the drunken sailors and pursuivants sleeping it off on the benches. Mary had slept in brief, terrified spurts, waking each time to the sound of the wind or the realization of her predicament. Eric had not moved from his post at the door, seemingly tireless, a sentinel carved from shadow. His stillness unnerved her. She rose from the pallet, the wool gown scratchy against her skin. He acknowledged her with a slight nod, his eyes already assessing. "The storm holds," he said. "That gives us time, but Mallet is a hound. He will not be content to wait." As if summoned by his words, a heavy fist pounded on their door. "Mistress Thorne, a word, if you please." It was Mallet's voice, smooth and laced with malice. Mary's blood ran cold. Eric was on his feet in an instant, his good hand on his cutlass. "Stay behind me," he murmured, and pulled the door open just enough to block the entryway with his body. Sir Richard Mallet stood there, flanked by 2 of his men. He looked as if he had not slept, his eyes red-rimmed but sharp. "Captain," Mallet began, his gaze flicking past Eric to Mary, who was huddled by the pallet. "A private word with your wife." "My wife is unwell from our travels," Eric said, his voice a low growl. He did not budge. "What business you have with her, you have with me." Mallet smiled, a predator's baring of teeth. "The business of treason, Captain. I have had a long night to think, and I find myself wondering what a man of your reputation is doing escorting a lady of her quality. A lady who so precisely matches the description of one Mary Hastings, late of the Queen's court, wanted for conspiring against Her Majesty's life." The accusation, so blunt and public, hung in the cramped hallway. Mary felt the floor drop out from beneath her. "You are mistaken," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. "Oh, I think not, my lady," Mallet sneered, pushing past Eric's shoulder to get a better look at her. "I knew your father, a weak man prone to foolish sympathies. It seems the apple does not fall far. You will come with me, now." He reached for her. Eric moved with a speed that was terrifying. He shoved Mallet back against the wall, the point of his nicked cutlass appearing instantly at the pursuivant's throat. "You will not touch her," Eric snarled, all pretense of civility gone. Mallet's men raised their muskets, the heavy bores aimed directly at Eric's chest. "Kill him," Mallet choked out, his eyes bulging. "No," Mary screamed, throwing herself forward, grabbing Eric's good arm. "Please do not." The hallway was a stalemate. Eric could kill Mallet in a second, but the musket balls would tear him apart an instant later. "Stand down, Thorne," Mallet commanded. "You defend a traitor to the crown, it will mean your head as well." "He did not know," Mary cried, desperation making her voice sharp. "He is what I said, my husband. He knew nothing of this. It is me you want." Eric looked at her, his blue eyes blazing with a strange, fierce light. He did not lower the blade. "Is this true, wife?" he asked, the word a bitter challenge. "Are you a traitor?" Mary met his gaze, and in that moment the lie was too flimsy to hold. I helped a friend, a priest, escape to France. He was hunted. They call it treason." This, Eric understood. He despised the vipers at court, the spies and informants like Mallet who grew fat on betrayal. Helping a friend was not treason. It was loyalty, a concept he valued above all else. He pressed the blade harder, drawing a bead of blood on Mallet's throat. "She is under my protection. You will wait for the storm to break, and you will wait for the local magistrate. You will not take her by force under my roof." It was a bluff, an appeal to a law that held little power here, but it was delivered with such conviction that Mallet paused. A brawl erupted. One of Mallet's men, impatient, lunged with the butt of his musket, aiming for Eric's head. Eric ducked, shoving Mallet into the man, and the hallway exploded into chaos. Eric was a brutally efficient fighter, using the narrow confines to his advantage, his cutlass a blur. But he was one man, and his left hand was a fiery agony, useless for parrying. He dispatched one man with a hilt strike to the temple, but the other brought his musket stock down hard on Eric's wounded arm. Eric roared in pain, his cutlass clattering to the floor as his hand seized, useless. The man raised the musket to reverse it to fire. Mary, seeing him defenseless, did the only thing she could. She grabbed the heavy wooden stool from the room and brought it down with all her strength on the pursuivant's head. The man crumpled. Mallet, freeing himself, stared at the scene, his 2 men down, Mary standing over one with the stool, and Eric clutching his arm, his face pale with pain and fury. Before he could act, Hobbs the innkeeper and 2 of Eric's own sailors, drawn by the noise, came charging up the stairs. "No murder under my roof," Hobbs bellowed. "God's teeth, Sir Richard, the storm is judgment enough. Take your quarrel outside." Mallet, outnumbered and momentarily thwarted, straightened his doublet. He looked at Eric with pure hatred. "This is not finished, privateer. You have made your choice." He retreated down the stairs, his remaining man dragging his stunned compatriot. The door slammed shut below. Mary rushed to Eric, who was leaning against the wall, breathing heavily. His newly wrapped bandage was soaked, a bright, shocking crimson. The wound was ripped wide open. "Get inside," he grunted, shoving her toward the room. He followed, kicking the door shut and barring it. He slumped onto the pallet, the bravado vanishing, leaving only a man in excruciating pain. "You were a fool," Mary whispered, her hands shaking as she unwrapped the bandage again. "He would have taken me. And I," he ground out, "gave my word. A thorn does not break his protection." She looked at the mangled flesh, tears of anger and fear stinging her eyes. "Your ship," she said suddenly. "You said you lost your ship." He looked up, his defenses shattered by the pain. "I, the Harpy, my commission, my crew, my entire fortune, dashed on the rocks. I have nothing left but the clothes I stand in and a name that brings me nothing but trouble." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "So you see, my lady, you have allied yourself with a ruined man, a captain with no ship, a brawler with one good hand. We are quite the pair." He was not the wealthy, powerful savior she had imagined. He was as desperate as she was. She met his gaze, the last of her court-bred fear dissolving, replaced by a fierce, unfamiliar resolve. She dipped the linen in the brandy again, her touch infinitely gentle. "Then we are ruined together, Captain." The small room under the eaves became their world, a fortress against the howling storm and the simmering malice from the common room below. The pain of Eric's re-injured hand had subsided to a dull, relentless throb, and Mary had tended to it with a fierce concentration, her earlier trembling replaced by a steady, competent hand. The shared violence, his reflexive, costly protection of her, had irrevocably shattered the barrier between them. They were no longer a fugitive and a stranger, but two people bound by a shared enemy and a shared desperation. The lie of husband and wife had taken on a strange, brittle truth. They sat in the dim light, the candle guttering, and for the first time they truly spoke. He learned that her treason was not a plot against the Queen, but an act of loyalty to her childhood friend, Lady Arundel, who had been arrested for harboring a Catholic priest. Mary had not just known, she had arranged the priest's passage from London. "She would have died in the Tower," Mary said, her voice low, her gaze fixed on the rain-lashed shutter. "They would have put her to the question. I could not let that happen. Loyalty is not treason." Eric, who had spent his life navigating the brutally simple loyalties of a ship's crew, found himself agreeing. "Court loyalty is poison," he said, his voice rough. "It is a word they use to dress up their greed and their fear. Your loyalty is true. Foolish, perhaps, but true." He found himself telling her of his life, not as a boast, but as a confession. He spoke of the Spanish Armada, years ago, and the sheer, terrible beauty of the burning ships. He spoke of the gold he had taken from Spanish galleons, commissions that were half piracy, half patriotism, and how all of it now lay at the bottom of the channel. "I was saving," he admitted, the words tasting strange. "Not for another ship, for land. A small holding away from the sea. This was meant to be my last voyage." The admission hung between them, a testament to a future that had been stolen from him by the same storm that had delivered Mary to his door. He was a man of violence, but he was weary of it. And she, a woman of the court, was weary of the silks and the whispers that were just as deadly. The air in the room grew thick with unspoken things. The proximity that had at first been a torment now felt like a shield. He was sitting on the pallet, his back against the wall, and she was beside him, close enough that her wool-clad shoulder brushed his arm. He looked at her, truly looked at her. The pearl earring was gone, lost in the mud or the fight, and her strawberry blonde hair was a glorious, tangled mess. There were smudges of dirt on her cheek, but her eyes were clear and direct. "You should have let Mallet take me," she whispered. "My ruin should not be yours." "He would have taken you," Eric repeated, as if it were the only answer that mattered. "And I find I am not willing to allow it." He moved slowly, giving her ample time to retreat. He lifted his good right hand and brushed the tangled hair from her face, his calloused thumb grazing the soft skin of her cheek. She did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, a small, involuntary movement, her eyes fluttering closed. The deep-seated chill she had felt for days was finally receding, replaced by the radiating heat from his body. He lowered his head, and his mouth captured hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was not the chaste, dry press of lips she had experienced in the gardens at court. It was a kiss of desperation and possession, born of the storm and the fight. It was rough, his lips firm, tasting of brandy and salt and something that was uniquely him. He claimed her mouth with the same confidence he had claimed her as his wife, and she responded with a matching, surprising hunger. She gripped the front of his doublet, her fingers clinging to him as the only solid thing in her world. This was not romance, it was survival. It was a raw, visceral acknowledgement that in this room they were the only two people who mattered, their pasts destroyed, their futures uncertain. When he finally broke the kiss, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, his breathing heavy. "I know a man in Bridport," he said, his voice thick. "A captain. He owes me his life. If we can get there, he will take you to France." "Us," she corrected him, her voice shaky but firm. "He will take us to France." Eric looked at her, a long, searching gaze. To take her was to abandon any chance of reclaiming his life here. To flee England was to become a fugitive himself. He saw the price in her eyes, and he saw she was willing to pay it for her own freedom. He realized he was willing to pay it for hers. "I," he said, sealing the promise. "Us." Just then, a change in the air made them both freeze. The incessant, high-pitched scream of the wind had died. The hammering rain had lessened to a steady, relentless drumming. The storm was breaking. Mary's hand tightened on his arm. "He will come for us now." "At dawn," Eric agreed, his voice hardening as he shifted, reaching for his cutlass. "And so he shall." The false dawn was a wash of bruised purple and sickly gray, filtering through the cracks in the shutter. The oppressive howl of the tempest had subsided, leaving behind an eerie quiet broken only by the drip of water and the distant, angry roar of the surf. Below them, the alehouse was stirring. They heard the scrape of benches, the bark of orders. Mallet was not waiting for full light. "He is moving," Eric said, already on his feet. He tested his weight, his re-injured hand a fiery agony, but his resolve was iron. He looked at Mary, who was pale but composed, her eyes wide and fixed on his face. "The choice is made," he said, more statement than question. "The tower or the sea?" "The sea," she replied, her voice firm. She had bound her hair back with a strip of linen, and the ill-fitting wool gown now seemed like a uniform, practical and ready. "Good." He went to the small window, unbarred the shutter, and peered out. The room was at the back of the inn, built over a lower kitchen structure. Below them was a short drop to a sloped roof, and beyond that the cliff edge, a sheer drop to the rocky cove below. "The kitchen roof is below. From there, it is a climb." He turned back, his gaze assessing. "It is treacherous, slick with rain. Can you do it?" "I must," she said simply. A heavy boot crashed against their door, making the wood shudder. "Open, in the Queen's name," Mallet's voice. Another crash, and the bar splintered. Eric did not waste time. He shoved the heavy straw pallet against the door as a temporary brace. "Go," he commanded, gesturing to the window. "Out onto the roof. Move toward the cliff edge. Do not look down." Mary scrambled through the small opening, her skirts catching. She landed on the wet shingles of the kitchen roof, the wind whipping at her, threatening to pluck her from her precarious perch. Below, the sea churned violently, a chaos of white water and black rock. She swallowed her terror and began to edge her way toward the cliff, her fingers and stockinged feet slipping on the slick wood. Eric was right behind her, his cutlass clenched between his teeth, his bandaged hand held close to his chest. The alehouse door burst open behind them. "There, on the roof!" A man shouted. Eric landed beside Mary just as the first musket shot cracked through the dawn air. The ball splintered the shingle where Mary had been a second before. "Move!" he roared. He grabbed her hand, his grip crushing, and pulled her toward the edge. He knew this coastline. He had seen the small, treacherous paths the local fishermen used. He found it a narrow fissure in the rock, barely a foothold. "Down," he ordered, going first, his body shielding hers from the inn above. "Use your hands, your feet. Feel the rock. Do not trust your eyes in this light." It was a desperate, agonizing descent. The rock was sharp and slick. Mary's hands were raw and bleeding in moments, her practical gown tearing. Above them, Mallet and his men were at the window, trying to get a clear shot. Another musket ball whined past Eric's ear, striking sparks from the cliff face. They were half climbing, half sliding, using gravity as a reckless ally. Eric, even with one hand, moved with a sailor's grim agility, guiding her, cursing, pulling her bodily down when she froze. "Almost there, Mary. Do not fail me now." They tumbled the last few feet onto the rocky beach of the cove. The noise of the surf was deafening, the spray cold as ice. "This way," Eric yelled, pulling her toward the relative shelter of an overhang. Mallet's men would be descending the cliff now, or worse, running around to the main path. They were trapped between the pursuivants and the murderous sea. And then Eric saw it, a miracle of the storm. Wedged between two high rocks, battered but intact, was a small dinghy. "My ship," he breathed, a harsh laugh escaping him. "The harpy, she left me a gift." It was one of his own ship's tenders washed ashore. He checked it frantically. It was missing an oar, but it was sound. "Get in." He shoved her toward the boat, and with his good hand and his shoulder began to heave the dinghy across the rocks and into the churning surf. The first wave struck it, nearly capsizing it, but Eric held it steady. "Get in, now!" Mary scrambled aboard, falling to the bottom. Eric gave one monumental shove, leaping in after her as the boat was sucked backward by the receding wave. He grabbed the remaining oar, using it as a rudder, a pole fighting the water. "Hold on." The sea that had destroyed his ship now sought to claim them. The dinghy pitched and yawed, climbing monstrous waves that threatened to swamp them. Eric fought with a desperate, focused fury, his teeth bared, his body straining as he used the single oar to keep them pointed out to sea, away from the rocks that would shatter their fragile craft. Mary bylaid water with her bare hands, a frantic, rhythmic motion, her gaze fixed on him. He was magnificent, a sea god in a stained doublet, his will against the ocean's rage. Above them on the cliff they saw small figures, Mallet and his men. They were firing, but the range was too great, the boat a cork on a violent sea. The shots were lost in the roar of the wind. Eric did not look back. He set his jaw and rowed, pulling them out beyond the breakers, into the relative safety of the deep channel's swell, leaving Sir Richard Mallet to rage impotently on the shore. Weeks later, the sun was bright and warm, shining into a small, clean room in Calais. The window was open, letting in the scent of bread baking and the distant cry of gulls. Mary sat on a stool, mending a tear in a linen shirt. It was not fine linen, but it was clean. Her hair, cut shorter for practicality, curled around her face, and her hands, though still marked by the climb, were quick and sure. The door opened, and Eric entered. He was clean-shaven, his sea-browned skin making his blue eyes startling. His left hand was heavily scarred, but he had the full use of it again. He placed a long loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, and 2 apples on the simple table. He came to her, kissing the top of her head before sitting, his long legs stretching out. "I spoke with Captain Leblanc," he said. "He has need of a master's mate for a voyage to the Low Countries. He pays well." "That is good news," Mary said, smiling. She was no longer Lady Mary. She was Mistress Thorne, the wife of a merchant sailor. They had nothing but the few coins he'd sewn into his boot and the promise of work. But as she looked at him, at the quiet strength in his face, she knew she had everything. The storm had taken their old lives, their status, their fortunes. But that night, trapped in the alehouse, they had found something else. They had bartered their secrets, and in doing so, had forged a new future. He took her hand, the scarred one covering hers, and squeezed. The reckoning had come, the price had been paid, and the future, while not the one either had imagined, was theirs.